Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Zen Behaviour for Learning webinar, which I'm really grateful you've joined us for. I'm particularly grateful to our speakers, who you'll meet in a minute. It's an important time and an important topic, and I'm really grateful for Zen that they've hosted this. A few little domestic things. Please, once you listen to the speakers' comments, please can you make sure that you put some questions in, put them in the chat or put them through to us so that we can do it. The speakers are not going to speak for that long, and the session will be richer if we can get into dialogue. That's where you'll end up with better results for all of us. So please think about your questions as you go through. Then at the same time, please can you note that we're recording this session for those that weren't able to attend. So without any further ado, I want to introduce our speakers. I'm lucky that we have Dan and Colin. They're going to tell you a bit more about their CV and what they've done before when they each do their sessions. And we've also got Olivia, who is our in-house SEN trainer and expert, as well as an account manager, who's going to do a bit at the end, in particular about what Zen does to support the ability of TAs and others to work effectively in schools. I'm really grateful, first of all, to our first speaker, though. If I could come to our first speaker first, Dan, who is the national, well, no, let me get your title right, National Leader for Behaviour and Accountability at Academies Enterprise Trust, one of the largest academy trusts, but has a long career before. I've been working with Dan probably less than a year, and I've been extraordinarily impressed with his knowledge, his insight of behaviour for learning, expectations, the research that's there, pragmatic advice, and an extraordinary understanding of Ofsted and the accountability framework for all sorts of reasons that you'll hear in a minute. So I'm really looking forward to what you've got to say, Dan. I know that it will be useful for all of you who are online now. So I'll shut up. I'll then come back on when it comes to chairing the conversations. That's all from Toby. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Toby. No pressure then, and thank you very much for that introduction. So, hi, I'm Dan Owen. I'm a former Senior Majesty's Inspector for School Inspection Policy, and I led Ofsted's research on behaviour in advance of the EIF, which introduced some new things around behaviour, as most of you will have seen. And as Toby said, I'm currently the National Lead for Accountability, and that includes responsibility for behaviour across a large multi-academy trust. And I'm going to be talking just for about between 5 and 8 minutes there about what we understand about behaviour and why behaviour is so very important, and really the thing that unlocks learning for children and their feelings of safety in school. So I'm going to talk about 3 things just for the next few minutes: the current educational landscape as it relates to behaviour, how schools deal with behaviour, you know, how they address the issues that they sometimes have with behaviour, and then finally what behaviour is, how we ought to think about it, conceptualize it, because the concepts we have about behaviour can drive policy and practice, not just at the whole school level, but they can drive our actions in the classroom. If we conceptualize behaviour in particular research and evidence-led ways, it can actually adjust our relationships with pupils, it can help us to defuse situations, and it can help us to manage behaviour so that children can learn and feel safe in the school environment. So we'll start with the current landscape. First of all, people will have noticed, or hope they've noticed, that in the EIF, which was launched in 2019, September 2019, and was paused for a little while during the pandemic, there was an attempt to split apart personal development, behaviour and welfare, what used to be called PDBW. And PDBW was 2 judgments that were made, and the lower of those 2 becomes the overall judgment for that section. Now, if that lost you, quite rightly it did, very complicated and didn't allow people to focus really piercingly at behaviour. It got messed up with some other things. And so Ofsted's probably signalling by having a separate section on behaviour and attitudes the vital importance of behaviour as being central to pupils' ability to learn and feel safe in school. So that new section signals the importance of behaviour, the centrality of behaviour. If we think about the grades that schools get, both under the old framework where behaviour was mixed in with other things and the new framework. Behaviour and attitudes grades tend to be higher overall, if we look at all schools in the system, than the overall effectiveness grades. You know, quite a few schools could be inadequate and have a grade for behaviour and attitudes or behaviour in the old framework that was higher than that. And that raises some really big questions, I think, for the whole sector. Is it that children's behaviour is generally better than the overall effectiveness of the school? Or is it that behaviour is really difficult to evaluate, really difficult to see? Because really behaviour is a social concept. People look at it in very, very different ways. It's a response to socio-cultural aspects of a school, and it's really complicated. It's complicated to get right, and it's quite easy to get wrong, actually. And I just wonder whether the higher grades for behaviour signal how difficult behaviour is to see, to deal with, to evaluate. Teacher surveys tell us that one of the key things that just irritates the wits out of teachers, that makes them want to leave the profession, that grinds them down, is low-level disruption. You know, low-level disruption, I've had this personally. You know, I can remember my time in the classroom quite recently, and a year 9 class just drove me absolutely potty. What was I going to do with them? It happens to all schools, you know. It's not that children are bad. It's not that schools are bad. It's that things change sometimes. You know, a new cohort comes in and there are some issues within that cohort, maybe social issues, maybe those pupils have issues outside of school. And sometimes it takes a school by surprise. But sometimes, and I'll talk about the boiling frog in a minute, it's not a surprise because everyone just decides that they're going to put up with it. But low-level disruption really just drives people potty. And as a result of that, we get these responses in the sector sometimes that that attempt to deal with it. So thinking about the big picture, what's happening in England right now, what are people talking about? They're talking about zero tolerance approaches, whatever that might mean. They're talking about flattening the grass. They're talking about draconian methodologies. And for those of you who know your classics, you know, Draco's a really terrible person and didn't really rule very well. We've also got this idea of warm strict, which is quite fuzzy, but we need to delve into what that really means to understand the impact that has on children in the classroom and teachers in the classroom. And then we've got this conversation coming out at government level too, behaviour hubs. We've got a behaviour czar, in fact, as well. And we've got conversations going on in the press and what have you, and in statements about the centrality of behaviour, and the government stands behind head teachers and teachers in really wanting behaviour to improve. So what happens in schools about behaviour then? This is the second point. How do schools deal with behaviour? Some schools, pupils behave really well a lot of the time, almost all the time, some of them, and we could genuinely say not very many problems here. Those schools tend to be ticking over while keeping their eyes wide open to when something might happen, and knowing that it's most likely in their school to happen on a Wednesday afternoon in science in the B block. They're not schools where children are just naturally going to behave in the ways that the school expects. They're the schools where a culture will have been built, usually over a long period of time. And if those schools retain that good behaviour over a long period of time, chances are someone in that school's got their eyes open to it, and they've been through peaks and troughs, because people don't do what we expect when we expect them to. And that's a really important thing to remember. We are not robots as adults. And so we really shouldn't expect children to be robots as young adults or smaller people. It's just not a natural thing for them to do. They are going to push up against our barriers, and some of them are going to push up really hard against our barriers. There are other schools, though, that I would put into the boiling frog category that don't realise behaviour in their school is not good enough. Now, often it's not that people are climbing the walls, and you could walk those corridors and say, oh, you could hear a pin drop. You could walk those corridors and say, oh, people are so polite. Children open doors for me. Chances are, on a Friday afternoon, the person teaching Year 9 arts having a hellish time. And chances are someone's decided that's okay because it's the teacher's fault. because they're not very good. Or maybe they've decided, yeah, that's just a hard year group. You know, year 9, all the research shows year 9 are really difficult. It's inevitable. We're going to have these things. And sometimes those situations fester and things get worse and worse. We think, there's no really good empirical research on this, but we think it takes about 6 weeks for behavior to go through the floor, for things to get so difficult that it takes a lot longer than 6 weeks to draw things back and to rebuild a really decent culture. So what does good behavior actually mean? You know, I say to people in my trust, good behavior is good for everyone all the time. And if it's not, you know, and you're doing something about it and it's changing swiftly. So it's not to assume that it's always good. It's to assume that it's good for everyone all the time. And when it's not, we know, and we're doing something about it really swiftly. And that's everybody's job. It's not good enough to be in the classroom and say, well, do you know what? I'm new here. This is how people treat new people. Not good enough. And it's not going to help anyone in the long term. How else have schools dealt with behavior problems? Well, of course, we've had all of the stuff about off-rolling in the press as one way in which some pupils have been ejected from the system. We've got 8,000 thereabouts permanent exclusions. We've got fixed term exclusion rates going up. None of this really tells us a huge amount about the quality of behavior in schools in England, actually. You know, exclusions can be used very well and really, really badly. We've got AP bursting at the seams. We've got internal exclusion. Nobody really knows how many children spend time in internal exclusion. All of this tells us that behavior is key. It should be at the forefront of our minds. We should be really thinking about what the concepts are around it and what we ought to do about it. We've got silent corridors, which doesn't really mean silent corridors. It means respectful people moving through a building in a respectful way and saying hello to the teachers as they pass, if you listen to what really happens in those schools. We've got making SLT, senior leaders, fully responsible. You just teach and mark, and we'll do everything else. You don't need to have a relationship with the pupils. Not many people went into teaching to only have a relationship with the knowledge. Most people went into teaching because they want to see the joy of that knowledge being vibrant for children and young people. They want to have that professional relationship where the knowledge makes the children powerful. We get to see it and it's brilliant. Then you get make the staff responsible. We've got to put the location of the responsibility into the classroom, and staff are having to do detentions at the end of every single day. Staff are having to deal with everything themselves as well as try to catch these children up at lunchtime. Forget that I gave someone a detention. There's no system in place to make the detention work and happen. You can see how that all falls down and people stop bothering. So I think the points I'm trying to make here, it's at the forefront of governance mind. It should be at the forefront of schools' minds. We shouldn't miss the fact that it takes a lot of work to get behavior ticking over well in a school systemically. You can't take your eye off the ball. It involves everybody, senior leaders and teachers. And when we get those titles like silent corridors, those kinds of things, we should really look for the detail that's underneath them. What are we trying to achieve through them? We're achieving a calm, orderly environment where people are professional, where people treat the school with respect and each other with respect. So moving on to conceptualizing behavior. At its core, behavior is a way of communicating something. It's really quite simple. You know, even if someone's trying to, I remember a tweet recently from Tom Bennett. Sometimes when a child tells you to off, they're just telling you to off. Absolutely, it's not acceptable. But they are communicating something. And you know what? If you're going to cross that line and use those words, there's something happening for that child that's important. There's something important for us to listen to with that. But do you know what? You might hear that when you go into school, but low-level disruption that's probably not that strong is going to be the thing that people butt up against in most circumstances, most of the time. So at its core, that behavior is a method of communication. It could be conscious. It really can. You know, children might be aiming to get kicked out of a lesson. They could be thinking that. They could also be doing things that are semi-conscious, where they've got some notion of what it is they're trying to do, but not entirely sure what's going to happen next. And it can be really quite subconscious, where we just have a child, a young person who is full of adrenaline and not really particularly in control. And what they're communicating with us is that they're not in control and need some help. So it's not necessarily the case when we're in the classroom, and this is where it gets to sort of the chalk face. When we're in the classroom, children are not necessarily communicating things they know they're communicating, but we should always be reading and asking ourselves, what does this behavior mean? It can be a response to something from outside the classroom, but there are many ways we can mitigate against poor behavior in that classroom. So What is that child communicating? Low level disruption is the most common thing I think people will find in classrooms. Depends on your environment and the context, but generally that's the sort of thing people are going to have to deal with. And it's more serious than it sounds, isn't it? Because no one wants to be a teacher that's a babysitter. Nobody wants to be using work with children that doesn't really help them to learn the curriculum. Nobody wants everyone to be really, really quiet and do nothing and sit and stare facing forward for half an hour before I can get your attention. That's not what we really want. We're there to teach children. We're there to, enliven the curriculum for them. So it's really serious because it curtails learning. But the other reason it's really serious is, and it's hard for us, I think, as adults sometimes, put yourself in the shoes of that anxious, young, year 7, stereotypically you'd say girl. Makes no difference really. Sometimes they're smaller than their peers. Sometimes they're from families where culturally they haven't seen or experienced the same things as those other children. Sometimes they're the one person from their feeder school. It doesn't feel safe for them when the teacher isn't in control. I'm not talking climbing the walls. I'm talking when the teacher isn't teaching the lesson. That doesn't feel safe. And they take that sense of, oh, I don't really feel safe. And they take that out of the classroom. They feel that throughout their day. And if they go to multiple lessons where that takes place, that low level disruption chips away at their confidence in the school bit by bit over time. It does not prepare them to learn the curriculum. It doesn't prepare them to feel safe and confident to ask a question in front of people. It doesn't do the thing that we, as teachers really want: confidence, independence, learning the curriculum, feeling powerful, all of those things. So it's really, really serious low level disruption. Often, what are pupils communicating? They're often telling the teacher in the classroom that it's okay here to sabotage your lesson because nothing's going to happen. Or we've done this before, it's learned behavior. When we get someone new, we're going to try them out for a few weeks. Not acceptable, because those few weeks curtail the ability for a pupil to learn, for pupils to feel safe. Or maybe the negative consequences of poor behavior, as they've been learnt by those pupils over time, are in balance with the positive consequences, because it's actually quite a lot of fun to goad someone. It's totally inappropriate, but bullies find that positive sometimes, and we have to balance out these things. So what can we do to make sure that the reward of behaving well outweighs any negative immediate consequences? These are often learned behaviors. As I say, they've learned that they can do it in art. They've learned they can do it in PE. They've learned they can do it in the changing rooms or in B block and what have you. They're learned behaviors. So what are the important things? So research shows us that a calm and orderly environment is the best environment for children to learn in. Calm and orderly. Doesn't mean it can't get exciting. Doesn't mean it can't get noisy. It means calm and orderly, safe, relatively predictable for pupils. Lateness and level disruption need to be taken hugely seriously, and schools need to do that on behalf of the teachers, but the teachers also need to do that on behalf of the whole school environment and organisation. Pupils need to feel safe and valued. Really, really important, because that creates a climate where behaviour is more likely to be good. Clear, high expectations at all times that everyone understands, with clear consequences that are fairly and consistently applied, while taking into consideration protected characteristics and reasonable adjustments at all times. A culture of respect. Now, if we think about how children learn, key piece of research from Willingham, that he talks about warmth and approachability being really important. Let's not fall into that relationships are the key. Relationships are one of the key things, but if children feel they can approach someone who has warmth, who is also really organising their classroom well, so that they can learn well, they're not lost within the knowledge. That is the key to positive behaviour and a great relationship where children will want to learn. Of course, none of that is easy, is it? And none of that's easy when we're maybe going into a class that we haven't seen before, haven't seen for a little while. So what can be done? I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of all of the different techniques. You'll hear some more of that in a few minutes, but high level of organisation is massively important. The point at which you're handing out post-it notes and asking them to divide them in two, checking everyone's got a purple pen of power and a green pen of destiny, as well as a textbook open at the right page, but differentiated in 3 ways, that's when you've lost your ability to see everything that's happening in the classroom. That's when you've lost your ability to explain really well what the children have to do. And if you're trying to do the register at the same time, we know that we've totally lost it, haven't we? High level of awareness of who's doing what. You know, often when we see new teachers, when they're having a conversation with a child in the classroom, I'm not talking sort of one-to-one quietly, you know, what are you doing in your work? I'm talking from the front. They appear to be having a conversation with a child in the classroom, and 29 other people, or sometimes 30-something other people, they know that conversation's not for them. Remembering those pedagogy 101s, teaching 101s, when you're having a conversation from the front with one child, you're having it with everybody, and everybody needs to listen, which means you can't look just at that child. You've got to be looking at this child over here. You've got to be using your hands, all those things we learned to draw people in, to tap on the table. You know, you are not supposed to be doing that. Come and sit here. All of those techniques that we know. And then that general pedagogical awareness, avoiding cognitive overload, absolute clarity of instruction and explanation, and warmth when someone approaches you. Thank you very much for listening to me go on, and I'll look forward to people's questions later.
Dan, that was great. Thank you. Please do put your questions either in the Q&A or in the chat box. And hopefully Dan's provoked some thoughts for you. I'm now going to hand over to Colin. Colin, you need to introduce yourself as well, if you may. I know you're an SEMH expert, but others may not. So if you, yeah, you are. And you're still smiling, which is fantastic.
Yes.
So Colin's going to build on what Dan's just said, and I think it'll provoke more questions, but you'll also find it very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. Yeah, so I'd never call myself an expert because I fall down quite a lot, and I've learned from the millions of mistakes I've made rather than thinking before I leap. So I'm an SEMH deputy head teacher of a pupil referral unit in London. It's a primary referral unit. My background's been in primary, mainstream schools, and also in specialist SEMH provisions. So for children who it would always appear have permanently ended up in the specialist provisions. So I've done that for forever, it feels. I was asked to talk really about my experiences when, for about 2 terms 4 years ago, I decided to move out of class and in a permanent post, and see if I could teach in classes again, because I was in senior leadership and I felt I'd lost credibility. So I took terms to joined up with Zen, and I did a mixture of day-to-day supply and also a fixed term supply as well, just to see if I could still hack it with 30 children running around. I survived just, and I've been able to bring that forward now into back into the pupil referral unit I'm working in and in the primary schools that I'm supporting currently. So for a lot of you, the first day in is quite daunting. You're not quite sure what you're going to get. You don't really get to pick the school. So you're not sure whether it's a school that's highly organised and efficient, or a school that's, let's say, less organised and less efficient. And I think it's also important to understand that there are 2 types of supply. There is the day-to-day supply, where you go into a school one day and then you leave and you go into school another day, or the more fixed term contracts, you know, term or a few weeks or a half term. There are some slight differences in how you can approach your first day. I think the first thing that's important to understand is when you go into a school, it's almost an acting job. You have got to try and morph into what the school represents, into their culture in a way. And if the way you normally deal with things is very, very different to the way the school would deal with things, you're on a back foot before you've started. So I think the first thing that's really important is when you go into these schools is, first thing to do is just to get there early. I think most agencies will say get there by 8:30, and that would give you about 20 minutes to get in, find out what you're doing, and by then really it's time to go outside and collect the children. So the earlier you can get there, the better. Sometimes not possible. I was called up once to go to a school where the teacher had fallen sick at 9 o'clock as the children were due in. So I didn't get there till about 10:30. And I've walked into the classroom and suddenly the children are in charge. And so I had to work doubly hard then to try and get the children on my side and me being in charge of the class rather than the children sort of already in the midst of their learning. So I think getting there early is important. It means you can build on things before the children walk in and set the scene early. So it brings me into the next point is once you know which school you're going to, read their behaviour policy, get online and look at that policy really clearly. It will tell you what the rules or the values are. Some schools have rules and values. Some have got rid of rules and have got values, but they mean the same thing. What does the school stand for? What do they expect? You'd hope it's not a tome. I think most schools now have reduced it from an 80-page booklet of 700 rules that you can and can't do. Most schools now have got a manageable number. So get to know what that is. Get to know what the routines are if they're on there, about how they expect the children to be in the corridors, for example, the silent corridors in some schools. What are the rewards and sanctions that the school already has? And if you can understand those things, you can start to bring that into the classroom and make that part of your behaviour management strategy. And I think that's really helpful then because it makes you look credible, makes you look like you are part of the school team. And I think that's really, really key to giving you that kudos when you start talking. I think also if you can listen out for the phrasing that some schools use specific language, and you'll hear it almost regularly in those schools that do it really well. If you can pick up on that and hook that in, they're bonus points then. The children start to think, hang on a second, this person's part of the school rather than you being a target. Which when I was at school, supply teachers, unfortunately for me, were easy targets, and I was quite ruthless at times. So I've learned from that, from my wayward ways. I think knowing the name of a member of senior leadership team is really important. Starting to build some level of relationship, however superficial it might be, because if you're there for a whole day, it's not going to be easy to build a strong relationship. But if you know a member of senior leadership team, specifically if they tend to manage the behaviour in a school, using their name sometimes, introducing yourself to them and inviting them to come and pop in at some point during that day, preferably before the first break time, is important because they can pop in and say, hi, Mr. Franklyn, for example, how are you doing? And I'll say, oh, it's good to see you again. Suddenly your credibility again goes up. The children will start to think that the staff there know you. Also going to the classroom next door, I found that was really important. So I would always quickly go in and introduce myself to the teacher next door. What that does is for that teacher is it builds a very brief relationship. And it means that if they hear some noise next door, they're more likely to come round just to check in rather than just shut the door and ignore what's going on. So building those sort of they're quite superficial, but those relationships with the key adults is important for the children to see there's that communication. I think something that's the most difficult is trying to build or embed a routine. It's very hard when you go in and you start to say things like, okay, we need to have hands up. And the children say, we don't do hands up for Mrs. So-and-so. You don't want that to be the case. So picking up on those routines quickly is really important, but also setting out your routines very early on is key. For most class teachers in substantive roles, that's going to take 2 weeks of them repeatedly saying, this is how we line up in the morning. This is how you need to ask questions. This is how, if you need to get out of your seat, this is how it's done. When I say set to work, this is what it should look like. That takes lots of modelling. And I think as a supply teacher, if you're doing day-to-day supply, even more so, you've got to condense that whole piece of work into a few minutes of speech first thing. So setting that off with who you are and saying to them, okay, to get the best out of this day so that you get the best learning and so that we don't waste any time, this is how we're going to do things today. And if those children say to you, we don't do it like that, you say, I know Miss didn't do that. I'm not Miss. This is how it's going to work best for us today, and then get started. And I think by doing that, you're exuding that level of confidence that you know what you're doing. They're going to understand what you're expecting from them. And I think that's important. It's totally pointless waiting, 25, 30 minutes into a lesson and then saying to the children, why is there all this noise? I don't want this noise, because you're already going to get into a conflict situation. So set out your stall and your expectations right at the beginning. Make it really clear, as few words as possible. Script it. It's what I did personally. I scripted out what my expectations would be for a successful lesson, a successful day, and I shared that with the children. And I think that's really, really key. Ask for a seating plan. And I know some of you now are going to be saying, we only get an A4 sheet of paper that says what we need to teach. But if you can just ask, is there a seating plan available? Is there one next to the teacher's desk? That way you can see very quickly who's who. Once they get seated, when the books are going out, I always do a little tour. I'm sort of a bit old school, so I sort of have to do that tour of the class before I can let them carry on working. It's a bad habit, but it works as a supply, because as you're wandering around, the books are being given out, you can quickly see who's who and where they are. If they're sitting in the wrong place, name them, ask them to move, and let them move, give them that time to move on. I think the meet and greet is probably another key point, really. When you bring them in from the playground, or if you're in the classroom just before they come in, being at the door as they come into your classroom. And I say into your classroom because as the teacher, that's what you need to be portraying. It's your classroom for those few hours, few days, few weeks. As they come in the door, making that gentle eye contact. Good morning. How are you? Even after break time, how are you? How is everything fine? And just bringing them in. What that will do is that will make very quickly that human contact with them. And I think we're social animals, so we like to be noticed. We like people to notice us, and for us to notice other people. And that hormone kick, I call it sort of that little squirt of happy hormone, happens every time you talk to somebody in a pleasant way. What it also does is it means that you very quickly pick up on any children in there who may be struggling in the next 20 minutes of that lesson. And you can either ask them to stand by, or you can make a point of when you start them off working to go to that child very quickly and just speak to them quietly about how they're feeling. If you notice them before they want you to notice them, you can sometimes diffuse things a lot quicker. Be prepared. I often went into classes and did my spiel, said off you go, and then half the class put their hands up and said they haven't got a pencil or paper or whatever it might be. I forgot it, it's at home. Some of them genuinely might have done. Some of them are winding you up. And that is a really quick way of low-level disruption, completely sabotaging your whole lesson. So what I used to do is I have a pack of pens or pencils and some line paper on the desk ready. Whether I used to ask when I got to the school, can I have a pack of pens and some paper just in case? That way, when a child says, I haven't got a pen, you've got a pen, you can pass it to them quickly. It's just those shortcuts, really, so that you don't give anyone wriggle room to expand on the podium that they're about to step up onto. Something I see supply teachers do sometimes, and I did it the first few times I was in schools, is I avoided sanctioning. And it's a really tricky topic, because if I say to somebody, you've got detention, the likelihood is they might join the conflict. They might start to stand up against me. And do I want that? Can I be bothered? I'm going at 3 o'clock. I won't have to put up with this tomorrow. There is that human temptation to go down the easy path. But what you're doing is you're making a rod for the next teacher's back. Or even worse, the next time you go into the school, you've lost those kudos points, because you're not that safe pair of hands that keep everyone else happy and calm and are working hard, what you've done is you allowed a child to ridicule everybody, to break the school rules, and to get away with it effectively. And one of the mantras I go to schools and say to them all the time is, size of a consequence isn't really important. The inevitability that it happens is the thing that makes the difference for children and adults. You know, why is it people still break the speed limit knowing they could get 6 points and whatever fine they could get or end up in court? They do it because the percentage chance of being caught is very low. And so you've got a better chance of getting away with it. So make sure you know the school policy on that. Give the child a warning. I'm really sorry you're feeling the need to do this. However, if you continue doing it, the school rules say you'll get a detention. You'll have to see me for 2 minutes at break time. You have to push that through. The fact that you've made the contact with the senior leadership team means that if things happen in that classroom, and we don't work solo, we have to work as teams, you can then say to a child, can you pop along and just get Mrs. So-and-so for us? Because this child needs to go and take a walk, take a break, think about what he's going to do next. So don't avoid that sanction. It is very, very key. I think really when you go into those classes, and I think Dan touched on it, the importance of being calm, consistent, and caring are really important. I think the level of confidence you bring into that classroom means you're in charge. The caring element means that you're not going to get flustered, and getting flustered is terrible in a class because you've lost before you've started. And being caring is key because you're going to make that human contact with those children. That doesn't mean being fluffy, doesn't mean saying, oh dear, never mind. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be saying to them, I care about your learning. You should care about your learning. And together we're going to move forward with this. And I'm talking in a kind tone all the time, even if unfortunately I'm given a detention. So that's where we are there. So the next point we were talking about, just looking to see if it's going to move across, is a transferable toolkit. Sorry, it's the slide before, Ross, sorry. I go around schools a lot and teachers say, I want something I can use, something that's transferable. And none of these have come from me. These are things that I've heard and learned and tried. And in combination, they're really effective because they're ways of understanding the psychology of all adults and using that to your benefit. So the first thing I would say, and I see schools, teachers do it quite often, is they use the word please. It's a really simple one. As soon as you use the word please, it's very plaintive. It's a begging word. And if you're under high levels of stress, your stress will come out through the word please. And what you don't want to do is show that to the children. So it's a very, very old thing. A guy called Bill Rogers, who's been around since about 1750, is a fantastic behaviour management person. I really rate him. I'll share a book with him later that I really recommend getting. He always ends all of his phrases and instructions with the word thanks. He does it in a fantastic Australian accent. It works much better that way. But often we'll say to a child, you seem to be tapping your pencil there. Other children can't hear. Pop that down, thanks. Saying thanks is really important because what you're doing is you're assuming that it's going to happen. What I do, and it's quite brave if you know you've got a very volatile child in the room, is to deliver that, turn around, walk away. Therefore, you're physically showing that you expect that to be done. And it gives that child a time to think, shall I do it or shan't I do it? Is it worth my while causing a problem over a pencil I'm tapping? I've found it highly effective. It doesn't work for every child, but 99% of the time, and you know, when I've worked in SEMH provisions, it still works there. The other thing to think about is your praise to criticism ratio. What you always want to do, you want to convince the child's brain that you like them and that they're going to like you. You're going to fill them with those happy hormones, and you're going to avoid as much as possible raising the hormones that lead to conflict, that adrenaline rush. I always talk about the brain being in two parts. So we've got the cognitive brain, and then we've got all the bits underneath, the functioning part that keeps us alive. And psychologists out there will say it's in two parts there, but I call it the reptile brain because it's the part that's least evolved, and it's the part that saves us from dying. Effectively, it keeps us alive when there's any sort of trauma, when there's any sort of panic. It will stop us, prevent us, hopefully, from hurting ourselves. But it's outdated, and it reacts to things that are quite minor. So what you want to do is you want to keep that cognitive brain running, and to do that, you say nice things. So you keep your praise high. Needs to be really good praise as well, genuine, without overindulging yourself. I really love the way you did that. Or thanks for popping your pencil down. That was really, really handy. Thank you. Or, you know, I love the way you stopped talking first. Really appreciate that. Or thanks for getting down to your work nice and quickly. That was really thoughtful. Thanks. It's quick, it's snappy. The child, it goes in for the child. Sometimes they can't even tell you what you've said, but they know you said something nice to them. When you're criticizing, keep it very short. Put the pencil down, thanks, move away. Keeps it short. It reduces the need for the child to argue with what you're saying. And the more you can do that, the better, the shorter you can keep it. The praise needs to be high. Lots and lots of studies say 12-to-1 ratio, 8-to-1 ratio. I've tried that. It's very, very hard. I think if you can aim for 6-to-1 praise to criticism, so 6 really positive things that have gone in there to the class before you pick somebody up is really key. Don't count it. Don't do 6 and then tell somebody off and then do another 6, because then it becomes very artificial. But just keeping that in mind, that the more positive that class is, the more on your side they are. And I haven't, not part of my notes, but I always talk about classes as being part of the gang culture. People always talk about it in a negative form. The reason they're so successful is they put high levels of praise on people. So they pull them into their team. They say, you want to be part of this. This is more exciting than that. So this is how it works. So as a teacher, you want to be sort of, if you want to be the leader of that group. Sorry, Toby.
I'm going to say you've only got 2 minutes or so. Thanks. I said
thanks. That's okay. No problem.
Yeah. There's a bit of me that doesn't mind you going on a bit longer because it's actually very useful and very I'm doing your top tips now because obviously we won't have time for questions or
no, that's fine. I was just going to say the next parts were about how you do the praise. So it needs to be very descriptive. You need to make the point of why you're doing it. I see teachers doing it with, you know, jazz hands and various other things. Don't do that because it's artificial. Be genuine about what you're saying. Proximity praise is fantastic, and that's even in large classes. And that's a question that's coming up later. In those large classes, whole school, I think some people will appreciate if they've been heads. If you go into the middle there and you say, I love the way that year 6 are sitting up beautifully, because they got their arms like this, and they got, if you really do the fingers on the lips still, and fingers on the lips like this, suddenly a majority of the people will join in, or the children will join in, including staff, which is worrying sometimes. But that's important. Proximity praise, people want to be part of the team. They want to be part of the masses. So if most people are doing it, they want to be part of it. I think ignoring secondary behaviour is key. I'll briefly demonstrate something that Bill Rogers does very well. Sandra's on the phone. Sandra, the school rule is we don't have the phone on, thanks. Put it away, you can play it later. Sandra rolls her eyes. The temptation is, don't you roll your eyes at me. She tuts, don't tut at me. Suddenly you're into an argument, whereas actually what you wanted to do is put a phone away. So proximity praise and then moving into ignoring that secondary behaviour is key. And I'll finish because I've covered the others actually, but the final part is just reiterating that calm, consistent, caring and confident teacher is really important for you to have a successful day in your classroom. And I will stop there.
Colin, we need another one because there's more there that was really, really helpful. And I did the first cardinal mistake. I called you Dan instead of Colin. But it worked.
Oh, that's fine. I didn't notice.
No, there you go. there are a few questions that come through. If I say to people, the participants, if you've got questions, put them into the chat or the Q&A, then I can farm them out to Dan and Colin in particular, and Liv where appropriate. Liv's going to do a bit at the end. I want to try and finish by about 5 to 5. So you've got sort of 10 minutes for questions. If you don't have many questions, then we'll get some more top tips from Colin. I'm putting you on warning now, Colin. Some more Bill Rogers. And you're absolutely right about Australian accents. Does make a difference. So the few questions that are coming already, let's just have a look at the first one. The first one, Dan, your first reaction about detentions. So detentions can be a reward. Bad behaviour is often a cry for attention. A detention is the reward of one-to-one attention. So detentions are counterproductive. I don't want to get into the social media Twitter debate between warm, strict, and different types of behaviour. And people have different views of what detentions are and different understandings of that. But what's your view of detentions? And then I'll come to you, Colin.
Nor do I want to get into that argument. It's cyclical and very, very boring. Okay, so we need to think about what the ends are that we're aiming for, and then think about the means with which we get to those ends. So if a detention is proving to be something where a pupil or most pupils or lots of pupils are finding them the reward for the behaviour, and therefore there's some causality between the behaviour and that as a reward, we need to ask some really deep questions about the relationships that children need, and to put those relationships in elsewhere, not detentions. And you would want to probably break, wouldn't you, that link, that causal link between those two things by giving that child what that child needs in a separate environment, in the hope that the behaviour would stop. Likelihood is, in terms of what we know about psychology, that there is no direct causality between the behaviour and the need for detention. It would be in a small proportion of cases that child would get the one-to-one. In the schools where this is going really badly, you have whole halls of children sitting facing the front desks doing absolutely nothing for half an hour after school, getting no attention. It's just that at the point at which they're displaying the behaviours, the balance between them not wanting to be in the detention, and it's almost that delayed gratification as well, that, you know, I've not thought about what it's going to be like at the end. And some children will be in that over and over and over. And it's the children that have the sanctions over and over and over that are stuck in the washing machine that we need to start thinking, what's the ends we're looking for? The ends we're looking for is great learning, feelings of safety, warmth, the serotonin that comes from learning and having good relationships, and for pupils to feel like they have a relationship culturally with the school. So if the sanctions are getting in the way of that, we could argue, I'd argue very strongly, but we could argue, change the sanctions.
Colin?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think, you know, if you're getting a child who, you know, is getting, you know, detention after detention after detention, is clearly not working. So you need to think, why is that not working? You know, what does this child need? Because I think it's very much, you know, I'm never much about this attention seeking. I like this attention needing. You know, they need it. So how can we make that more productive for the child? And then, as Dan said, get back to that good learning. How can we get that child back onto the purpose for why they're in school? So,
I mean, lots been said about sanctions and knowing what the school sanctions are. And I think one of the advantages of being supply teachers is you have a fresh, objective eyes, and if you see something that's an anomaly, it's perfectly acceptable to say to school at the end, I really don't understand how, or you need to understand that this isn't a sanction anymore because it has a perverse effect. And I think that's entirely appropriate, because you are, one of the extra things you bring is some objectivity. Colin, this is a question mainly for you. You talked a lot about first impressions, and you're absolutely right about how to, you know, and the first time coming in and meeting the teacher next door and how to impose yourself. I think what Magda's saying here, a lot is said about the first impression. I'd love to hear more about what to do with the class or group that already knows you. And I assume that means, what about those where you know the behaviour's already started to slip? Dan's 6 weeks issue. What do you do about that?
well, I think I was actually at a school where I was just popping in, you know, a day a week, and then I was asked to. It was a school that had really unfortunate Ofsted, and the school was sort of, the class was highlighted as being difficult, so I was asked to go in there full time. So they already knew me, and I hadn't been able to set my expectations as well as I'd wanted to. So I had that conversation with the children. I knew I was going to be there longer. So I said to the children, this is where we are. This is what's happened in the past. We're drawing a line. This is how it's going to be from now on. It's really important that we get onto the good learning, that we're not wasting time, and that you're getting to be seen as being, you know, a good class. They already knew that they were being highlighted as not a good class by various things that had happened in the past few weeks before I walked in. So we set that stall up. And it was very difficult because what you're trying to do is undo some challenges that you've, and I was guilty of it, I'd allowed some of those things to pass through. It's a bit like I always say with parenting as well. If you wait until the child's 10 before you say no, you're going to have to spend a very long time undoing that. And I think as a teacher, it's difficult, but you have to hold your nerve, to set your expectations very clearly and practice those routines, get them back out into the playground, lining up, let's go in. It wasn't quite right because there was some chatting. Remember we said quiet voices down the corridor, let's go back and do that again. It works really well, and it's things that were going on when I was a child at school, and it sort of vanished because teachers thought that they needed to get the children in really quickly and start the lesson. But of course, if you get the children in quickly and start that lesson, the lesson's not going to be very productive because they're still unsettled. There's that low-level disruption, which I find more irritating than the bigger things like chair throwing, for example. You've really got to get that scene early, get them in, get them sat down so they know they need to be still. So yeah, it's very hard, Magda, but I would start from scratch. I would say, this is what we're going to do. These are the routines that I'm expecting, and we're going to practice those over the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. And I think it's important to remember you should be able to ask a respected colleague in the school, and do not take I don't have a problem with that class because it's Dan's year 9 art teacher. Make sure that you ask, and if necessary, put the investment in of going and watching how another teacher manages that class, so you know what the norms and expectations are. Now we're going to run out of time, and we could do this all day long. I'm going to ask the last question, and then Liv, I'm going to come on to you, and you might mop up some things as well. But is getting the behaviour management more important, or is getting through the lesson plan given by the teacher more important? Well, you can't do the lesson if you haven't. Anyway, Colin, Dan, very quick responses. Dan.
The behaviour is a prerequisite to quality learning, feelings of safety, and actually your primary role of being in that classroom is safety first and pupils' feelings of safety. So I think behaviour first and then teach the lesson. But I think also the two things are intertwined. If the lesson causes some cognitive disfluency, then you're going to find you have behaviour issues. Yeah,
thank you. Colin, here, last question. I'm not going to ask you that one because Dan asked that. What do you think is the best strategy to stop and argue that an argument that a student tries to start about a warning or detention? It's a bit like your early eye comment. Oh yes, you did.
Yes, I think you have to bypass that. One of the things, and I didn't touch on it completely, but I do a fogging, so this partial acknowledgement. So I understand you're really upset because, however, the school rules are, and therefore this is the consequence. I mean, some children are just going to argue until they're blue in the face. There's no point in stepping in on that. It's just about reiterating that point. These are the school rules. This was the school rule you didn't follow.
Yeah.
Here is the consequence of that.
Broken record. Liv, 2 minutes. Liv is going to tell you a little bit about what we do to support, and in particular TAs. I was a TA for a little while, and it was the hardest job I ever did. Because particularly when you've got a class that's not good, trying to sit there and influence behaviour when you're watching a teacher not manage a class very well is absolutely agonising. So huge respect. Liv, over to you.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you to Dan and Colin for the really insightful
excellent presentations. Thank you, both of you.
Absolutely. Most of you already know me. You've seen me on a couple of other workshops, but my background is mostly with children and young people with special needs and mental health needs. I was working as a support worker and have come across, my fair share of challenging young people and managing their behaviour to make it more effective for learning. So there's been a couple of workshops where I've gone over strategies to help children with more special needs and how you can help them with their behaviour. But why we care so much about effective behaviour for learning at Zen is really to help you feel confident, whether you're doing one day of supply or whether you're going into a long-term role at any one of our partner schools. We want you to feel confident walking into every classroom. And so we want to host workshops like this. We want you to have access to tips, etc., in order for you to feel safe so that you can help the children feel safe and establish a really wonderful learning environment for them, and also for our schools as well. We want our SLT members that we work very closely with to obviously be impressed by you, and it can also then help you secure a longer term position if that's what you're looking for from the daily supply. And Ross, if you just move on to the next slide, behaviour management is one of the biggest things that our schools pick up on, and our schools have the option to leave feedback at the end of the day on teachers, and obviously, you know, providing that it's all good, you can then publish that for all other schools to see. So it really does increase your chances of securing daily supply or long-term roles through us as well. It's one of the best impressions that you can make, and I think Colin gave a really good example of you know, mentioning SLT. Please drop into my lessons, you know, see how I'm doing, and you know, also help me establish that sort of authority in the classroom with the children. The sections on the platform, you do have a section where you can fill out what your approach to behaviour management is. And obviously, you know, following the school rules and the school behaviour policy is paramount. And we do have a section on every booking confirmation that you will receive, where you will have information or access to the school website, or in some cases directly to that file uploaded. So, you know, if you're taking public transport, it's the perfect opportunity to download that, have a quick read through, and make sure that you are walking into school knowing exactly what the sanctions are, what the policies are, who any safeguarding leads are as well. That's everybody's responsibility. And then if you've got any unique things that you like to do in order to, you know, maintain a great learning environment in your classrooms, your profile is the place to highlight that. For example, if in my classrooms, we've had a noisometer, and I would move the arrows up and down in a visual way to show sort of what level of noise we can work at. We've had a couple of teachers who have used sort of like shakers, maracas, etc., to get, you know, noise to stop it immediately. Things like just completely unique, and you can apply it to every setting that you've worked in, whether that's secondary, AP, special schools, etc. And it's a really lovely read for us and a really lovely read for schools to know that they've got the confidence of the teachers coming into their schools via Zen. So yeah, if there's any questions left, we can try and sort of get some answers offline, but I think we are out of time. So a massive thank you to everybody for joining, and to Toby for hosting.
No, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining. You can go and have a cup of tea now and switch off. Dan, thank you very much. Colin, thank you very much. Liv, thank you very much. Thank you for the questions for everybody. I thought that was very fruitful, very interesting. Colin, I look forward to the book. If people do have further questions, then you know where Liv is. You can email Liv. If she doesn't know the answer, she can ask us, but I think she'll know the answer. But thank you very, very much for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you for the lovely comments that are coming in now. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Colin. Oh, Bill Rogers' book, Colin, quickly. On mute. You're on mute, Colin.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, so it's classroom behaviour. He also does behaviour management book. But I'd also say Paul Dix's new book's really good. You know, yeah. Everything Changed If Adults Change, and the Tom Bennett Running the Room is the new one. So those three are kind of my top tips for reading.
If I might add, Sarah Dove's new book, Behaving Together, is especially useful for SEMH environments or any environment where you'll be with with pupils and want to really understand and get underneath what's happening there.
You are fabulous. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.